Welcome, everyone. I hope you're really enjoying your time during this MCTM conference. I'm super excited to share with you some of the experimenting I've been doing with something called cultural interviews. I highly recommend you see that bit.ly at the very top. I highly recommend you get that copied down or typed into another tab because I have lots of links and things to share within this document. And so it would be very useful for you to get your resources from there. My name is Jessica Strum. I'm a high school math teacher in Northwestern Minnesota, and I'm also currently the MCTM High School VP. You can see my email there and my Twitter handle, and please feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'm super excited about this topic. It's something I've been playing around with for a couple of years. I have lots of growing to do, and I'm just excited to share what I've done so far. So just know that this is still a work in progress, but there's some really good stuff that I want to be able to share and see what you guys can come up with. So the cultural interview, I can't claim as my own at all. So I was lucky enough to go to this ethnomathematics conference or workshop in 2019, hosted by one of the people hosting it was Dr. Jim Barta, who is the Dean of College of Arts at Bemidji State University. And let me just say, this was something that I really find cultures interesting, all kinds of cultures, my own, other people's, like there's just super interesting things going on in people's different cultures. And so I've always found it interesting. And so then when I saw that there was such a thing as ethnomathematics, I was like, wow, like what could this really mean? And where could I take it in my classroom, but also just in my professional life? Like what is a possibility? So I went to this. And there's lots and lots of things, great things shared there. And one of the things that Dr. Jim Barta shared was this, what he calls a cultural interview. And so I spent the next couple of years just kind of looking into it, playing around with it in my classroom. I tried some things I'm not totally happy with, but I'll share them with you. And also meeting with Dr. Barta a few times just to talk about it. One of the things that is an excellent resource for people is a book written by Dr. Barta and some colleagues called Math is a Verb. So I highly recommend that you check it out. But I just want to make sure that I give credit where credit's due to Dr. Barta. So before I get going, I really do want to make sure that you that I explain where I'm from. So I teach in Northwestern Minnesota, the small K-12 school. It's called Winnie Mac. A lot of times it's mistaken for being thought of as being a Native American school, but actually it's just the combination of the three towns, their names put together. So Win is for Winger, which is a town that is, I don't know, about 8 miles from where I am right now in my school building. E is for Erskine. That's the actual town that this school is in right now. And Mac is for McIntosh, which is about 4 miles away, which is actually the town that I live in. And they consolidated these three towns into a small little district of a K-12 building. One of the things that I want to be upfront about is that we do not have a lot of cultural diversity here. We are mainly a white Norwegian school. Many of these students are Norwegian. They come from a Norwegian background. We do have a high population of something called Russian Orthodox. And they have a very different culture, and there's lots of fascinating things that I've seen in there. And as a teacher, and how I wanted to use this in my own classroom, that was one of the things I was looking at, is how can I incorporate more of our Russian Orthodox culture into the math problems I come up with, and make it more interesting to them. One of the frustrating things as a teacher is many Russian Orthodox students drop out of school before they get to their senior year because the boys tend to go off and start working in the business that their father has started or that their father owns and kind of keep the business going. They don't see a value in a high school diploma to be able to do that because they've already got a company to work in. They've already got the stability. And so they get to work really quick. The girls sometimes get married as a junior or senior. And then once they're married, they don't see the value of a high school diploma in their home doing what they do. And so, how can we get them to value more of what we're doing, find more interest in school? But there's also other reasons. I want my Norwegian students to start valuing other cultures, right? To start exploring other cultures, to seeing what they can do. But also I want them to start looking into their own, like what do they know about their own, like within their own little family culture, not just their heritage, but within their own little family culture, what do they do? So there's lots of fascinating things that I want to kind of explore here. But when I talk, some of my examples are going to focus in on the population of students that I have. I am super excited to hear from someone how this expands into a more culturally diverse area, that has more things going on. So I just want to make sure that I'm very upfront about where I'm at and who I'm working with. So let's get into it. So one of the things that I learned at this ethnomathematics workshop is there's something called the Bishop Six, and I'm guessing most of you have not heard of the Bishop Six, and it's super fascinating. So Dr. Alan Bishop is the first one who suggested such a thing. And when he was looking at all these different cultures, when we go and look at, cultures, if I look at what my grandparents grew up in, I'm not necessarily going to find trigonometry or calculus or solving equations, but what am I going to find? And so Dr. Alan Bishop says there are 6 things that you are going to find in every culture. It doesn't matter what culture you look at, there are going to be 6 mathematical activities that you are going to find. And so here they are. They're called the Bishop Six. And I'm going to go through them in detail, but on the surface, here's what they are. They're counting, measurement, locating, design, explaining, and playing. So many of our kids graduate with this idea that mathematics is solving an equation, working with numbers and letters and all this stuff. And so one of my goals in this is to get kids to appreciate mathematics for the fundamental stuff that it is within our own cultures and within our own lives. So let's look at what these 6 things are. Okay, so counting. So counting is kind of more the most obvious one of them all, right? But counting says, okay, what kind of numbers are used? So when you're looking into a culture, when you're talking to someone, what kind of numbers do you have words for? What kind of numbers do you actually use? Is it just whole numbers? Are there negative numbers? Do you have a word for negative numbers? What about rational? Like what fractions do you have? You're going to find that a lot of languages don't actually have words for fractions or nothing beyond 1/2. So what kind of fractions words do you have? What about irrational? Like, is there a word for an irrational, or do we have a square root word? What do we got? Another fascinating thing is to ask about, like, what is infinity? Like, what is the word for infinity? Do you have a word for infinity, or how do you say forever? Things like that. So exploring just the basic structure of what type of numbers are used within the culture. Another super fascinating thing is, like, how is your number system built? So sometimes if you look back on things, a culture will just, start out with tallies, and then it's based on 5s, the 4 tally and the 1, and based on 5s, because, you have 5 digits on your hand. Or maybe they don't write anything down, they just use their fingers and their toes. And then at that point, is it based on base 10? The structure of the words for numbers, how are they based? Is it 1 through 9, and then you have a new word for the 10s, and then it's a 10 and 1, 10 and 2, 10 and 3, and then 20 and 1, 20 and 2, 20 and 3. Like, how are their words for their numbers structured? And then I have abacus in there because, like, we look at the abacus as based on a base 10 type thing. So what is the number system? What base do they use? Do all cultures use base 10, or are there other bases that are used? Another thing is, what operations are used? Do you have a time within your language, within your daily life, that you talk about adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing? Do you have words for those things? So what we found in our exploration as a class is that, there's a lot of cultures that don't have a word for multiply, and so they just use the English word for multiply. Or they have, instead of a word, they have a way of describing multiplying. Sometimes the way of describing is so much better than any words that we have. It's really super interesting. And then what are any prominent or special numbers? So I'm trying to think here, 10 is an important one for us. But what are other numbers that are prominent? I know a lot of the Asian cultures talk about the number 4. And then, super interesting on why. And then are there any numbers that are superstitious? So we talk about the number 7 as being lucky, the number 13 is unlucky. So where do those numbers come in? So that's kind of the basics of counting. I found my students kind of focused just in on counting, like base 10 and things like that. But, you know, there's lots of really cool questions and really cool things you can learn about within counting. So the next one is designing. So, you know, designing comes in, and you see this in a lot of places, but we're talking about what kind of patterns do you put together? You see it a lot in the art. What kind of shapes are really important in the art? Is there triangles? What's going on? How do you put them together, make designs out of them? Are there angles that are super important? You know, if you talk about even just like the design of a teepee, you know, if we talk about that, like what is it? What shape is really important? You're going to see a circular, you're going to see the cone. What kind of angles? Are there angles that are important as you put those things together? So there's a lot of places you can go here with designing. Symmetry. Is there symmetry involved? Is symmetry really important? What about area and perimeter? Like, is that something that you consider as you're doing things? What about perspective? You know, like it doesn't even have to be about creating things, but what perspective do people have? Are they always looking at things head on or bird's eye perspective? And then also, what objects are you creating within your world? You know, I think about like, you know, in this area, you might, you know, go searching around, you might find an arrowhead, you know, like what was that object made out of? What was it for? What's the purpose of its structure? Like it's a triangular structure, things like that. So what are things that you make? We were talking to my friend May, and she was talking about, you know, a bowl used for separating out the rice. Like, what is the structure of that? Is it a deep bowl or a shallow bowl? Like, what are you looking at when you do those things? So there's lots of places designing comes in. You know, you're designing games. What are the shapes look like? Why are they shaped that way? What are they doing? Objects within a religion. Why are they shaped the way that they are? Objects within your home, tools that are useful, whether you're cooking or tools for keeping your home safe or structuring, even making your home. All right, so that would be the idea of designing. Measuring is the next thing. Measuring is actually, I found to be one of the more difficult things to do with my students and to explain and get them to talk about. But, you know, the big thing about measuring is, you know, you can talk about how do you compare things? Like, are there things that are important to be more of or less of? Do you have words for comparing? Like which one's more, which one's less, which one's first, which one's last? Are those important things? What about putting in order, first, second, third? Is that something that's important at any time? What kind of units do you use? Like if you're going to talk about going somewhere, how do you talk about going somewhere? Like if you have to travel from here to grandma's house, like how do you describe that distance? You know, I would talk about miles in my household, but maybe there was a different way of talking about it. Maybe it's the number of days it took, or you know, there was a story I had read about, you know, how many moccasins it took to walk that distance. And that's how they would describe it, as 2 moccasins away. You know, so what is it that they use to describe the units? So temperature, how do they talk about temperature, different things? And then also, what does this culture consider wealthy? Like maybe a culture considers having many children and then you're considered wealthy, or maybe it's owning land and then you're considered wealthy. So where is wealth in here? What would you look at as making you wealthy? Locating. Another difficult one to get the kids to interview about, and I'll talk more about what I mean by that, but locating is how do people use space? So is your culture just worried about your physical space? What do you say, you know, if I want you to turn north, do I say turn north or do I say turn right or left? One of the good examples I give my students about this is, so I'm in a very rural part of Minnesota. And, you know, there's a lot of streets in our towns or on our roads that don't have signs. So I can't say turn right on First Street because there's no sign that says First Street. So I might say there's a big white building on the corner, turn right there. Or, you know, in my hometown, I would say, hey, we are just 1 block past the lone tree. And that's how we would describe it. We describe it by landmarks. Whereas when I'm with my friends in the cities, you know, they're very much telling me about what street to turn on, that kind of thing. So, you know, how are you giving directions? How are you using north, west, south, east, or are you saying right or left? Do they have words for these things? How do you name places? So, how is your city named? How is your town named? How do you name your children? How do you name all these things? So locating, these are all different types of locating, but that's the physical type. What if we talked about time? So is time a big deal? Are you only, is your culture only focused on the present? Do you have a big connection to the past and the future? Or do you have a spiritual connection to, do you talk about, and this goes in with religion, but, talking about being in the spiritual world, being in the physical world, those kind of things. This is all very mathematical. And I'm going to talk more about, where do all these things fit within specific mathematics and how I showed that to my students. But this is all very mathematical stuff of how are you located? How do you give directions? How do you direct people, kind of stuff. Okay, this one's kind of fun, but also misleading. Playing. So a lot of people think of playing as playing games. I have yet to interview someone who doesn't have a game that they played or know of a game that is specific to their culture. So why is playing games a part of mathematics? Well, when you play games, you have a set of rules and you have a structure that you put together, which is very mathematical. If you think about, our theorems in geometry and all this stuff, we put together all these rules and we put together like, you have to do it this way, right? So it's very mathematical to do that. Another thing about playing is, there's a lot of probability games out there. And so, I don't know. Do I really need to explain that? So probability, right? So there's a lot of games that involve a probability, even though they might not talk about percentages and probabilities, but that's the mathematics going on behind the game itself. And then, making predictions. So when you're playing a game, you try to anticipate what's going on and make predictions. And that's a very much big part of probability. But another side of playing that I want to make sure my students understand, and that when I'm doing this, I understand, is what about the manipulating the world around you? So is there something within a culture where they might try things out and move things around and play around with, and that would be considered playing, right? So it's not just about games. It's about, you think about it in mathematics, we play around with things all the time when we're exploring something. And so that, testing out the structures. And what if I move it here? Does it change what's going on? So if we think about even just like developing a place where you're going to live, do I live close to the water? Do I not live close to the water? What can I do with the structure to make it more sound? How can I use a different material maybe? And so all of this development and all of this stuff is playing. And then we have explaining. So explaining, we do a lot of explaining. You think about logic. Why does something happen? If A and B are true, then C would be true. So that would be explaining. Another place in explaining is classifying objects. So understanding where things belong. A fish belongs in water. A cat does not belong in water. Classifying there, but also just understanding what would we classify as food, as not food, family, not family. So classifying objects would be considered explaining because you're explaining where do they belong based on the classification. And then, some of the fun stuff is just the stories that are told through generations that explain things. So we're Minnesotans, right? So my favorite example of this would be, we explain the number of lakes we have in Minnesota because Paul Bunyan walked around Minnesota and the lakes are all his footprints. So that's not really something true, but that's how we explain where all these lakes came from. So that is something that when you interview someone, those kind of stories do come out and they're kind of fun. And then, using astrology, how are the stars used, the planets, things like that to explain things. So those are the Bishop's six. Those are the things that Dr. Alan Bishop says you can go into any culture and you can find all six things. And that is what mathematics is. It's not necessarily just what we teach in our curriculums. So here's where I wanted to go with it. I wanted to put together class lessons. And I wanted to get to many different things. I wanted my students to learn about other cultures. One of the disadvantages, and I love living here and I love all my students and I love so many things about this place, but one of the disadvantages is that my students are very naive to other cultures. Like they know about their own, maybe, Can't actually guarantee that. And they maybe know a little bit, but a lot of what they're getting is from TV and movies, and it's just not what they need to be getting. And so I wanted to use this as an opportunity for my kids to learn about other cultures, and in that process, start appreciating other cultures. When they leave this area, they are going to meet people from other cultures. And instead of having the prejudices that they get from their media and from their, you know, all the different things that they bring in from, you know, TV and movies and things, I want them to go out there and actually learn that, you know, someone from a different culture, there's a lot to appreciate. There's a lot to learn about. There's questions you can ask to learn more about them, and to actually just start appreciating others. But I also wanted my students to start appreciating their own. You know, I have a lot of students that really just haven't asked the questions, and parents haven't told them about what their history is and what their culture is, or to look at what some of their family traditions are and start appreciating them for what they are. But I also want them within that to look in their lives and see that math is way beyond the stuff that I'm teaching them in algebra. It's way beyond that. It's all these different things. And that, you know, these jokes about, you know, I made it through my 70 years of life and never once used algebra, to understand that they did use algebra, they did use mathematics, and it's a big part of their lives. So, so these are the things I want to get out of this. I need to talk to my students. I haven't done this for very long, so I can't tell you that I have or have not done it, but these are my goals. So what I've done is I've experimented, especially this year. This is when I've done all my research, and this is when I've done all my tryings with the kids. So what I've done is, in a 5-day lesson, so it took me a week, we started out with talking about what is mathematics. So, you know, all these things that are underlined are links to the lesson plan or just notes that I made. But what is mathematics? And I stole this from Sarah Vanderwerf, who talks about how mathematics is a study of patterns and relationships. And so we have a whole day of talking about this. We did a little activity to play around with it and just to kind of see mathematics. So that it's not about the rules and things like that. It's just that I wanted them to understand and start really internalizing that math is something that all humans do and are capable of. It's not about the tests that they've taken and things like that. So then we went into, there was, you know, there's a lot of different things here. I pushed them into 5 days. So some of these things happened together. But the next thing I did was talk about counting. And so, you know, explaining to these guys about counting, it seemed a little bit too easy and easy to ignore what we were doing. So I decided, okay, so we're going to talk about the basics, and then we're going to get out an activity. So we did exploding dots. If you haven't heard about it, it's a great thing that gets these kids to understand the bases. And so they, you know, you explore base 2, you explore base 3, and you eventually work you up to way to base 10 and understand how, what the I'm going to call it a game, but it's not really a game, but the thing that you're playing around with, and how that is how our number system is structured. So I assigned them to play around with a few worlds on that. Know that this is also during the pandemic, and I have all distance learners. So, so some of my assignments are very distance learner based, and I would change it when they were in class. The next one that we did was measuring, or I shouldn't say next, because this kind of jumps around in my grand scheme of things. But then we talked about measuring, and I wanted them to kind of identify how measuring is in their world and what that all means. So we did what's a word cloud. I think it's called like Menti. I'm a foreigner where my face is, Mentimeter. And so basically I just asked them to type in the different units. What are units that they use when they're measuring things? And so we actually did this twice. What I did is I had them type in 10 things, 10 units that they use. And so the units that they type in the most often are the bigger ones. So you hear about height and weight and meters and, you know, all those words. I showed them, I brought them back, I showed them the word cloud that they came up with. And then I had them go back and do another 10, because I just, you know, a lot of times when you see other people's examples, you can start saying, oh, I remember, you know, then I do this and that. And I have, you know, a couple guys in here that are really into cars. So you can see that we have, you know, some of this horsepower, tire pressure, things like that, which is fun because they got to incorporate the things that they're interested in. So we explored the different ways that we describe things that we measure using this word cloud. Locating, talking about direction and how do we use direction. I had them play this game called Skyscrapers. If you haven't played it, it's super fun. It's super fun to get the blocks out. Unfortunately, they're at home. So I found one online where they could do the skyscrapers there. I had some that struggled a little bit, so we had to get out the blocks and play around with it when they were here, because I had some that would come once a day or once a week or something. And so we played with the skyscrapers, and it's really getting them to take a perspective of, if you're facing this way, there's a tall building, so you can only see the tall one. You can't see all the little ones behind it. And it's a game to kind of like Sudoku, but with height of buildings. And so just getting them to understand the perspective is going to be different facing it this way than if they're facing it this way, and getting them to kind of understand that. Playing was an interesting one that I was trying to figure out, how can I get these guys to play around with math? And I felt like one of the biggest places that we can do that is Open Middle. If you haven't explored Open Middle, just go to openmiddle.com. It's so many great things, and it gets the kids to actually play with math. They can see it as math, and then they can also very easily play with it. So, so this is the one that I had them use. So the idea of Open Middle is that you use in this rule for this one, there's a couple different ways you can structure them, but use the digits 1 to 7 at most once each. Place it in each circle or square, I guess, so that the sum of the numbers in 3 squares are the same. So basically ABC and BBE and FBG would all have to add up to the same thing. So we're looking for those things to be the same. And so what I did was I just put it on a Jamboard. I gave them little Post-its the size of those squares with the numbers 1 through 7. So once they drug like a 1 over here to A, the 1 wasn't available anymore. So it very easily allowed them to use them only one time. And they would lay them out and they would add them all up and see what they were. And they were working in groups so that they could discuss them and play around with it. And so they played with where they put the numbers and how they worked. And I just wanted them to see that that's really the essence of mathematics, is that we play around with things and see where the rules fall and how they work. So we did a Open Middle to get them to understand playing. And then for designing, I did a pattern block challenge, but I actually did that for designing and explaining, because what I had them do is I put out a hexagon, and they had to figure out how many triangles or how many different ways could they put other pattern blocks on top of the hexagon to fill it up. And then they were supposed to explain to me how they got that to work. And so within it, they designed and they played around and they tried things. And then they had to explain to me how they knew that those were all the different ways that they could do that. Okay, so let me skip ahead here. Okay, so then after I did that, that took me a week. And then we went to getting them to understand culture a little bit more. It's just not something we talk about. Maybe it's just here, but we don't talk about it a lot. So we talked about, what is culture? And so let's see here. One of the things I had them do was to, okay, I want to go back. I had them Google the definitions of different words. So we have words that sometimes people interchange. So it was culture, heritage, and traditions, and ethnicity. So what is the similarities? What are the differences? So here was the activity. Instead of me droning on and on about what these things were, I had them Google it. And then this was a document that they all shared, and they had to put a definition that they saw for these things in here. But the trick was, they could not put a definition that somebody else already put there. So if they found one and they went to the document and somebody already put that exact same one, they had to go back and find a different one. And so then within that, they've studied which ones they're all putting, each other's putting. So they've already read each other's and they're finding their own. Some of these, the cultivation of plants doesn't really make sense in the sense of what we're doing here. But, after they were all done, then we talked about what are the differences, what is culture. And I just wanted them to get an understanding. It wasn't anything I was going to test them on. They didn't have to have this deep understanding, but I just wanted them to get the idea of culture versus heritage versus traditions versus ethnicity. So we did that. The other thing that we did was they did Venn diagrams. So I put them into breakout rooms. We were on Zoom. I put them in breakout rooms. I gave them a Jamboard. And then they went and they had to fill out this Venn diagram. So I put 3 people in a group and I said, okay, what do you have within your family culture? So it did not have to be, I'm Norwegian, so I'm going to do Norwegian things. It was just within your family. You know, from the time you were born till now, what are things that you've done within your family, activities, traditions, things like that, and figure out what do they have in common and what do they have special on their own. So this is a group of 3. They were randomly put together and they started figuring out what are things. Now I could have given them more time. It's super difficult to do this distance learning because, you know, they can get off topic, things like that. But really, ultimately, they did a pretty good job talking about the different things that they do without being there and actually being able to hear their different conversations. You know, if they were in the room, I maybe could have directed conversation a little bit more, asked some specific questions to get them going. But here's another one where they put in their things. Please excuse our spelling issues in here. But, you know, these are things that they were able to talk about and start identifying their own cultures and family traditions. Okay, let's make sure I covered everything there. Okay, so that was one day. I did those things just to get them start thinking about their own cultures. So we've talked about the Bishop 6 very extensively with them. I've talked about their culture, gotten them to start thinking that. Now what I want them to do, my ultimate goal is to get them to do their own interviews. But what I found when I did this 2 years ago with my students, I didn't have a very good understanding myself of the Bishop 6. And so I did not a very good job explaining it to them. I've improved that. So the other thing I found was they're not very good at interviewing. One of the reasons they weren't good at interviewing, this is a couple of years ago, is one, they didn't have a fundamental understanding of the Bishop 6, so they couldn't do like follow-up questions to hone into the things that they wanted. The other thing is they just weren't good at interviewing in general. So I decided I needed to get them some good interviews. So what I've done is we decided to do some interviews as a class. So the first thing I did was I asked a woman and she works in our school building. She is a paraprofessional and she's from the Philippines. She moved over here, I would say 14 years ago, maybe. And her name is Annie. And so you'll see there that I have a video. We recorded her video of our interview. So if you are curious about it, you can listen to that interview. And then the other thing that we did is together as a class before she interviewed, we knew that she was coming from the Philippines. We set up this little structure that shows each of the Bishop 6, what they are. So just to remind us so that when we're in the middle of the interview, we have something to look at to remind us what it is. And then we came up with some questions to be able to ask. And so I asked the kids, because again, we're distance learning. She was in my room, we were Zooming, and my kids were at home, but she was in my room. And so I gave the kids a copy of this, each one had a copy, and they typed notes. So they typed things, what she said. So I did the interviewing, I did the questioning on this one, and they just typed notes of what she said. And I didn't type the notes in here, but you can watch the interview if you're interested. And so, so they kind of got an idea of what type of questions they are. They got to hear me follow up with questions to get more specific. And then they also practiced their, you know, recording of what was important for her answers. So that was our first experience. The next day, then we kind of talked about what were their notes, what were things that we noticed about the interview, how did they relate to the Bishop 6. And then my second interview was with May Vang Swanson, who is our fellow MCTM math teacher. And I was excited about interviewing her for a couple things. One, it's someone my kids didn't know, whereas they knew our paraprofessional. 2, May is Hmong, which is not a culture that my kids have much interaction with, much experience with. So I was super excited for them to hear someone different. And then also May is a fellow teacher. So, so we were going to get a little bit more involved. I wanted my kids to have an opportunity to start asking questions. I wanted to be able to go back to May actually and be able to ask follow-up questions. And I knew May, being May, would totally be open to that and be open to even me pausing the interview to do a little teaching. So, so we interviewed her twice. We interviewed her on a Wednesday. I regrettably forgot to hit record, so I don't have that interview, which is so regrettable because it was awesome. And so, So I did not hit record. What we ended up having to do is then on the next day, the students and I worked together to come up with some really good notes. Like we compared our notes with each other and we kind of compiled them. So you can see those in the bottom there, the notes. I have those notes put together of what did she tell us, just so that we didn't forget the things that she told us. And then what I had them do was I think I put together a Google form or a Desmos activity or something where they came up with follow-up questions. So based on what she told us, how could we hone in? What kind of follow-up questions could we ask that would tell us more about her culture with the Bishop Six? And so then on Friday, she joined us again, and you can see the follow-up video there. I did manage to hit record and get to the follow-up. So again, I'm trying to get these kids to, one, analyze the Bishop Six within these interviews, but two, to start learning about how to ask questions. So within those follow-up questions, I tried to get the kids to actually ask the questions themselves. So we tried to assign them. So, okay, when we got to this question, it was going to be Jana asking it. And I didn't force them to, because I have some that are super shy. So I didn't force them to, but they were able to ask the question in kind of a little more safe environment, knowing that May was also a teacher. So that was a lot of fun. There was a lot of really fun answers there, a lot of fun things to actually just learn beyond just this project. So then I was trying to focus them more also beyond the big cultural aspect of, I am German and here's what the Germans do. I wanted to focus them in also on just activities within their lives, things that they do, and how are those things mathematical. So within these little things, like we interviewed a para in our room, her name is Mandy Davis, and they do a lot of camping in the summer, and not my kind of camping where I have a running toilet. They actually go camping with tents and hammocks, and that's it. So that's a big family thing that they do. And I wanted these kids to see that there's math within everything. And can we find all 6 of the Bishop Six within not a culture, but within an actual activity? So that was my focus there. And so we interviewed Mandy and were able to come up with questions. So the idea was to come up with questions ahead of time, knowing she was going to talk about camping. What questions could we ask where we think we might find the Bishop Six? And so we recorded that interview of what she did. So you can check into that. And the reason I was doing that is because now I want the students to do those type of interviews, not the big overall cultural interview, but the actual, like the little interview of an activity. I did not do the best job explaining this to them though, but or getting that across at least. But here's how we went about it. So I wanted them to interview each other. So they were put into breakout rooms for a couple days. They were partnered up and they interviewed each other. So they were supposed to spend like day 1 interviewing, student A would interview student B. Then on day 2, student B would interview student A. And then they put together a project that kind of summarized it. So I wanted them to get the idea of now take that interview, which is raw data, and now turn it into a presentation and say, okay, student A, in their activity, their favorite thing that they did, or the favorite thing that they learned from a parent or grandparent, those kind of things. What is it that fits for measurement? And so what we finally came around with was, what did the interview come up with? And then also include an analysis of how does that fit? The interviewee, the person you interviewed, might not know how it fits, but how can you analyze it in the end and how it fits? And just make it very clear to the reader that this fits into measurement because of this. So in this, I wanted them to do a bunch of things. I wanted them to practice their interviewing skills, learn more about each other, really like dive deeper into the Bishop Six and make sure they understand it. And then also I want them to understand what I'm looking for in my final project. So here was their final project. This is my goal of where I wanted to go. I wanted them to interview someone in their life. So my imagining would be they'd interview a parent or a grandparent and talk about something from their childhood. Like, this is my, big idea. So like I interviewed my mom and I said, okay, when you were growing up, what was something that you did with your mom or your dad or your grandma or your grandpa that you don't necessarily do now, but it was special for you? And so, she talked about how she helped her dad on the farm. and they would have to stack hay in the barn. And so we went through that and talked about that, and I interviewed her on that. So that was the things I was kind of hoping that they would do, to hone in on one special activity. And so I wanted them first off to start looking at their own families and kind of learn some more. For example, that interview with my mom, I never would have known that stuff about her helping her dad, because it's not something that normally comes up in our conversations at home. And so it was really kind of interesting to me to hear and to just imagine life on the farm for her. It's a farm that I have never really visited all that much. And so to really just get to know that part of her life. I was hoping it would be like maybe grandma taught them how to bake a special thing that's special to their family, or when they were talking, grandma's grandma taught grandma how to do something, some of those things that would just be super special. And then if they didn't have that, could they interview someone from another culture like we had done with Annie from the Philippines, or May, who is Hmong? Like, could they interview someone from a different culture, maybe learn about another culture if they didn't have someone within their life to interview? So that was my goal. And then in the end, they would give me like a Google slide that came up with the summary of it all and kind of have this presentation. Again, is during a pandemic, it didn't go all that well, to be honest. Like, it stretched out forever. And if they were in the room, I could have had more control of what they were doing for the hour, but it took forever for some of them to actually get an interview in. One of my favorite ones was Kale's. She interviewed a woman who does rose mauling. So she didn't have someone that she could really interview. So I found someone who does rose mauling. If you don't know what that's just it's a Norwegian painting style. And so she interviewed her. It was super fun because she did it while I was in the room. So I got to, step in and ask a few questions too. But that was really interesting and really fun to hear about that. I've never really heard the backgrounds of all that. Remy, his dad grew up in Germany. He's not from Germany, but he's a military kid. And so he grew up in Germany for a while. So he interviewed him about stuff from there, which was a little off. I was kind of hoping he'd interview grandma about something that she grew up doing. But so he really was focused on the idea that the German culture is different than our culture. So, what could his dad tell him about? Jana interviewed her dad about growing up as a kid and hunting rabbits. And that turned out to be super interesting. And she has a really good presentation that shows some stuff. And then Kat interviewed her grandma about a business that she started with breeding dogs. And so she talks about those things. I found I put together a rubric for grading this because, and I shared it. I'm not going to claim to be a good rubric person, but this was just what I came up with, just so I had something. I wanted the kids to have something to know, where they could be on their score for this and things like that. So one of the things I asked for was for them to record their interview and to include little snippets of their interview within the Google Slides, just so that we could kind of hear the conversation. There's something special about that. So, I asked them to do that. And if they wouldn't do that, because they had to get permission from the person they were interviewing, then I also wanted them to put in pictures. Do they have pictures of the person growing up doing the thing, or where they were, things like that. So you'll see some of that. Also, there was times that they needed to put in a diagram. So like Jana put in a diagram of the snare that her dad would use to hunt rabbits, which was super helpful to understand when she was talking about the design of it, to actually see it. So that was super helpful. So those were things that I was really wanting them to put in there. Here's my reflections of this project. I don't know if it's because it was during a pandemic, during distance learning, that it didn't go quite as well as I wanted it to. The student projects were not quite at I wanted more analysis, and there really wasn't, but part of the problem was they weren't working during the hour. And so I didn't have something to go in and give them suggestions to change. So a lot of them I didn't get until the last minute, saying, okay, they're due now, you got to give them to me. And then they managed to get them out. But, I actually have 7 students, and I only got 4 projects. 3 of them didn't turn in anything. So I am frustrated because I feel like I wasted a lot of class time. And so I'm not sure if it was because it was during a pandemic and they were distance learning created a way with not working, or if it was just, this is just not the time to do it. I thought it might be because they're at home, and this would be really interesting to talk to someone from home or someone from their family. They would have the time. But It didn't happen that way. I don't know if it was student interest. I got the feeling the students were very interested. My best attendance for the year was during this project when we were doing all these things. Like that was my best attendance. And so I really feel like they were interested. I just, the motivation to actually follow through on it wasn't there. And then I already talked about, it was kind of difficult, the culture versus the activity. I was hoping they would focus in on activity, but some of them got sidetracked by kind of the culture. There's a little miscommunication, I think, there on what we were looking at. So as far as the students doing the projects, I don't know if I'm going to redo that again. It took up a lot of class time. I might try it when it's not a pandemic just to see if it goes better when the kids are in the room with me and I have a little more connection with them and can help them along and guide them. But I might not do them again. What I did find was super helpful was the interviews as a class. So when we interviewed Annie and May, those were super interesting and super helpful. My kids loved them. They came to class, they took notes. I mean, they were super involved and super in attendance. So I feel like that was super useful and I could control how long that took, right? I invited them, we Zoomed. It was super easy to do. And now that we have Zoom established, I feel like I can easily do an interview for my class. And just that alone is very rewarding. One of the things that I want to do with this is maybe I'm not going to have it be my students, do the Bishop 6 and my students do the interviewing or even see the interviewing. One of the things I want to start doing is I want to start interviewing people within my area. So, I talked about Russian Orthodox at the beginning, getting some of those people in and being able to just do an interview with them. And then from that interview, taking the information that they give me and using them to create more interesting problems that we do within the curriculum. And it doesn't just have to be in my classes, but could I come up with some interesting units for an elementary class that has to do with area and perimeter? Could we actually use something within these kids' culture that's more interesting? And I think that's somewhere where, it's on me, it's my time, but maybe I could just create a lot more interest for these kids when they're working on a problem. So maybe I'm going to talk about, Russian Orthodox has this beautiful church south of town here. So could we do something about area and perimeter with that beautiful church and maybe get a little more interest from those kids rather than talking about the dog pen that nobody even knows about because it's not anybody's. So could we incorporate some of that a little bit more? So I'm super excited about that. And maybe that's going to be a summer project to come up with different things. And I think, even if a bunch of people started doing these and we could compile them so that they could be used, it'd be kind of cool to put together cultural units that could be then shared with others. Another thing that I would like to do as a follow-up is something called story cards. So it's something I'd still like to do with my kids this year. Can they create a story card based off of what they interviewed about? So I'm looking around, just hold on one second. I was talking about the one that they talked about rose mauling. So here's an example of a story card. This is some rose mauling. You can see that right there. And I just photocopied this, but this would be a story card. And basically they're used in the elementary. So if you're interested in learning more about these, Eileen Cook and I did a session called Story Card that you can find. It's a pre-recorded session. But the idea here is that this is a rose mauling. This is the background. And then whatever you do as a story card also has a counting manipulative. And so I did something called Kringla. See if I can make that. So it's a breaded cookie type thing that my grandma taught me how to make. And this was my big cultural thing. And so I have a bunch of these in a little baggie. And you use the story card and you can create problems, manipulative problems, for adding, subtracting, which one has more, that kind of thing. So what I kind of like is for my students to then create story cards that can be used in the elementary, because maybe someone is Norwegian and they have rose mauling in their house. So they see this story card and they go, hey, I have that. That's really cool. I'm going to use that and have some interest. Check out that session if you're interested more in that. But I might have my students make some story cards from there that we can then use in some of the elementary classes. I just want to share a little bit of my research where I found these things. There might be more out there. It's actually really hard to find. There's the book that Dr. Barta put together with his colleagues. And then there's a paper that I found, super interesting, mathematical views within a Lakota community. And gosh, even if I wasn't doing this project, it was just super interesting to hear, you know, the answers to those questions, the Bishop Six, and how that all fit within the specific Lakota community, where are the words, that kind of thing. But I really want to thank you for joining me. I hope this inspires someone to try something. If you want to talk about it, I would love to have a conversation about this. I'm kind of alone here right now doing this, but I found it to be super rewarding. And I'm excited to start doing more of these, even with just within my own professional life, just asking people about this stuff and recording some interviews. So again, here's my bit.ly if you want to get in there and be able to look at some of these videos that I shared and notes and things like that. And I hope you all are enjoying the conference and that you will find something that you can get from this. All right. Thank you, everyone.